Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webcast. My name is Lauren Cornick-Dollar, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. I've been with the museum for about 3 years now and have greatly enjoyed getting to use my background in history, anthropology, and archaeology. I am so excited for everyone to get to see our newly renovated galleries, and I might just be highlighting some of our new exhibits and artifacts periodically here on our webcast. For the 2026 season, we are shifting our program ever so slightly to continue to provide our audience with a quality experience. We have a great lineup for you this year, filled with new speakers, authors, and maybe even some stories you're not so familiar with. Tonight, we will be hearing from Jim Noles. Jim is a professor of practice at Auburn University. He is a published author as well as a frequent contributor to the Alabama Heritage magazine. Jim will be presenting on West Point's basketball team during its undefeated 1944 season. Welcome, Jim, to the program. We're very excited to have you here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the reins over.
Lauren, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you to the National Museum of the Pacific War. There's actually quite a bit of connection, more than you might think, between West Point basketball in West Point, New York in 1944 and the Pacific War. I'll add, by the way, that with the Nimitz connection, I would, as a West Point graduate myself, I would be remiss if I did not point out that Nimitz actually wanted to go to West Point originally, and there was not a spot available for him. So he ended up going to the Naval Academy. I think that turned out okay for him, but I just had to point that out. But we'll talk a little bit more about the Pacific connection on my in this topic later on in our conversation. But I want to talk about what I've called our greatest generation's greatest basketball season and our greatest basketball team. Okay, and it's a topic of a book I wrote. So let's talk about that team. And let's talk about West Point. West Point on July 1st, 1941. That's when the new cadets reported at West Point for what is called R Day. And it's the beginning of the infamous Beast Barracks. July 1, 1941. We're not at war yet, right? We're not at war yet. We're still, it's obviously an interesting time in international history, an interesting time for the United States, but we're not at war yet. So these guys are reporting to duty, like this poor fellow right here on R Day, reporting in to join a military, to join an army that's still technically at peace. And there were some 600 or so new cadets reporting in that day at West Point at the United States Military Academy. They're actually reporting in. The interesting thing, they're reporting in as the class of 1945, because it's a 4-year course of study at West Point. So they're coming in expecting to be there for 4 years. But as you might guess, they're going to be overcome by events here momentarily. Among those 600 or so cadets showing up are these three gentlemen: John Joseph Timothy Jack Hennessy, Robert William Foss, Bob Foss, and Edward Charles Crystal Jr., Ed Crystal. These three gentlemen come in. They're off in different companies at West Point. They share something in common, though, besides the uniform. They're all basketball players. Let's talk a little bit about each of them. Jack Hennessy on the left here. Jack Hennessy is from South Chicago. He's the son of a steel worker at the Republic Steel Mill there in South Chicago. He went to Mount Carmel private school, a parochial school there in Chicago, worked the summers at the same steel mill his dad worked in, was a terrific athlete, actually attended St. Mary's College in Winona, Minnesota, went there for 3 years, and then had a chance to go to West Point. Then you've got Bob Foss. Bob Foss's mother ran a tavern in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Single mom. He went to the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse for 2 years and then went to West Point. Again, like Hennessy, coming in on on that July 1st, 1941. And then finally, we have Ed Crystal. Ed Crystal comes in from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He had also done a little bit of college time beforehand. In his case, he went to St. Thomas there in Minneapolis. And again, all three of these gentlemen end up at West Point on July 1st, 1941. They're there for that first semester. Well, what happens on December 7th, 1941? The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. And now they have gone from an army and an academy at peace to an army and an academy at war. And I can say this is very interesting for a number of the cadets because remember, they've got fathers, families at Pearl Harbor, at Schofield Barracks, in the Philippines. So it's a very dramatic time there at West Point as they're finding out, like the rest of their contemporaries, that we've been attacked. And a lot of them, like a lot of our contemporaries, as crazy as it might sound, did not even know where Pearl Harbor was or what was being discussed when we were talking about an attack on Pearl Harbor. So that's going on. By the way, there are stories about how the cadets were immediately talking about, we can't stay at West Point while we're at war. We're going to resign our positions at West Point and enlist. And the academy actually had to say, we are not going to accept any resignations. Your job right now is to stay at West Point and become commissioned officers. So that takes place. They stay at West Point, but here's the thing. The course of study is reduced from 4 years to 3 years. So this class of 1945 becomes the class of 1944. But I say the course of study has reduced. The studies have really not reduced. So now they've completely crammed 4 years into 3 years, tracking towards graduating in 1944. They've got close to the same amount of academic courses to take. They've still got all of the military requirements and obligations and training to do. They're still living, of course, under military discipline. Some of the cadets, almost a third of the cadets actually, are so-called aviation cadets. And these are folks like Bob Foss. Remember Bob Foss from Wisconsin? Bob Foss is training to become a pilot. There was a program at West Point at the time to where you would be trained as a pilot, receive your pilot's wings, and be commissioned as a lieutenant in the Army Air Forces at the time. You might call it the Air Corps, but by then it was being referred to as the Army Air Forces. So you had cadets that were actually, in addition to everything I just detailed, studying, training, going through flight school, and then, like these three gentlemen and many other cadets, they were playing intercollegiate athletics as well. All three of these guys, by the time that we go through 1941, 42, 43, now we're into the academic year 43 through 1944, they are seniors. Remember, we're short of 3 years. They're seniors. And in the spring semester of 1944, they are seniors on the basketball team playing basketball. So, like I said, everything that I've just related about what they're doing at West Point on this shortened course of study, to include in Foss's case here in the middle, Foss, one of the aviation cadets, going to flight school, and they're about to go into their final season of basketball. And I've got to say, the 1943 season, not a great season. The team went 5-10. Not a great season. But in 1944, they had a new coach. And it was this fellow right here, Ed Kelleher. Why did they have a new coach? Because Ed Kelleher had been coaching down at Fordham in New York City. And Ed Kelleher was one of the great coaches in the 1940s. Fordham was a powerhouse back in the 1940s. In their late 30s, early 40s, his teams were known as the Wonder Fives in the New York media. He was a great coach. The problem was for Coach Kelleher was that because of the war and Fordham losing so many of its students, Fordham was at a point where they could no longer field a basketball team. So, ironically, Coach Kelleher finds, at the height of his success, finds himself out of a job in 1943. West Point pounces on the opportunity. Remember West Point with its 5-10 season the year before. They pounce on the opportunity and they bring Ed Kelleher up the Hudson River about an hour and a half to West Point, and he becomes the coach of West Point's basketball team. So Ed Kelleher is the coach for Bob Foss, Jack Hennessy, and Ed Crystal. He brings in this, first of all, he takes advantage of the athleticism that he has of these cadets. And, some of them have already got college experience under their belt. He introduces this fast-paced run and gun offense. And with the cadets under him, he starts running the table. Here, by the way, is a snapshot of some of the games as they are playing. Happily, we don't wear shorts that short or that shiny now in modern college basketball, but this run and gun offense is just blazing through their schedule. And let me talk about that schedule. They start off playing Swarthmore. Ironically, you've got the cadets of West Point playing the Quakers of Swarthmore, and you can see who wins. Army 80, Swarthmore 29. They play Colgate. They play St. John's. They go down to the city and they play Columbia. They beat Columbia. Now they're 4-0. They play Wesleyan. They beat the Coast Guard Academy. They beat West Virginia. So they're playing not just some great basketball schools, but some large universities. They beat West Virginia. They go up to Rochester and they beat Rochester, which was a powerhouse back at that time in basketball. They beat Pitt, Hobart, Penn. Penn was another great basketball team. Now we're going from January, February, into March. They beat Villanova. They beat NYU. They beat Maryland. And then in a real nail biter, they beat their arch rival Navy. And West Point ends up with a 15-0 season. They've gone from 5-10 to 15-0. They run the table. And what would that normally mean today if you had a undefeated basketball team? Well, it'd be unheard of, essentially. But with a record like that, you'd be going off to play in the NIT, the National Invitational Tournament, which was the big tournament back then, or you'd be going off to play today, which the big tournament is, of course, the NCAA National Championship, the March Madness, the big dance, right? Well, the cadets on this undefeated team were told, gentlemen, there's a war on, and we know that you're great athletes, you're a great team, but you are not going to go play in the NIT, you're not going to go play in the NCAA championship. You're going to stay at West Point and stay focused on finishing up the semester and graduating. And that's what they did. It was interesting. That Navy game they won at the very end of the season, it was 100 nights before their graduation. And that's what they had to look forward to. Not going to the tournaments, not winning a national championship, but finishing up at West Point and graduating and going off into the Army. I'll add, by the way, that even today, West Point is still one of only 3 or 4 schools that could qualify, based on their division, could qualify to be in the NCAA tournament, but have never actually played in the NCAA tournament. And, that's interesting for a team being that has a record like this back in 1944 and another great record in 1945. So what do? They stay at West Point. They play some spring sports. Basketball was winter sport. So, Jack Hennessy was known as 3-star. You get a star for every varsity sport you participated in. 3-star Hennessy was a great athlete. In fact, the top athlete at West Point. He played baseball, he played basketball, he played football. So he went on and played baseball. Foss was a great tennis player, played tennis in that final semester. But they all go on and graduate on June 6th, 1944. And I bet those of you watching this webinar know what else happened on June 6th, 1944. Yeah, it was the day that we invaded the Allies invaded Normandy. D-Day. So this class ended up becoming known as the D-Day class. And as another strange little coincidence, one of their classmates was John Eisenhower, the son of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. And Mrs. Eisenhower was actually at West Point the day that her son John was graduating, and she learned about the invasion when she was staying at the hotel there. And a reporter called up and woke her up to ask her about the invasion. And she said, "I've got no idea what you're talking about." So these guys, the D-Day class, what a reminder that they are graduating, and they are going into an army at war. Let me get my numbers correct here. Some 474 cadets graduate. 297 of them went into the ground army, you might say, artillery, armor, infantry, of course, engineers, things like that. That was 297. And then 157 of them, such as Bob Foss, go into the Army Air Force. And they receive their flight wings that day. These guys graduate, they go off on graduation leave, and then they go off to their officer basic courses if you're in the ground forces, or in Foss's case, they go off for advanced flight training. And they eventually end up in these units. Let's start with Jack Hennessy. Jack Hennessy is commissioned in the infantry, and he goes to Fort Benning, Georgia, for his infantry officer basic course at the infantry school, and is then assigned to the 70th Infantry Division. And this is the unit patch up here in the top right. He's assigned to the 70th Infantry Division. He catches up with the unit in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, late in 1944. And very shortly thereafter, by the way, he's married at this point. One of the things with West Point is that you cannot be married as a cadet. And that probably is why, also happening on June 6th, 1944, there were 25 marriages that very day of cadets. Jack was not one of those, but he was married shortly thereafter. So Jack and his wife are at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. He's with the 70th Infantry Division, and in December, the unit is mobilized and of course they're mobilized. The unit is dispatched from the United States over to Europe and lands in Marseille in southern France in mid-December, and is dispatched north. At that point, as they're landing, the Battle of the Bulge is breaking out, and the 70th Infantry Division is moved up, a new division, onto the southern flanks of the Bulge, and is stationed there, and is then caught up in the German sort of second wave of an assault, Operation Northwind, where they find themselves fighting German soldiers on the southern part of the Bulge, and the brutal winter fighting that characterized that winter in Germany. So the young lieutenant ends up fighting through as an infantry officer, leading a platoon, and when his company commander is killed, leading a company in the fighting in places like Forbach and then across the Rhine into Germany. That's Jack Hennessy, 70th Infantry Division. Earns 2 Bronze Stars, I should add, while serving as a combat infantry leader in Germany, in France and in Germany during World War II. Then you've got, who should I go to next? I think I'll go to Ed Crystal next. Big Ed Crystal. He was 6'4". He was the tallest cadet at West Point. He played center on the basketball team. Ed Crystal from Minneapolis, Minnesota, was the team's captain, or co-captain with Bob Foss, I should say, generally recognized as the captain. Crystal was the team captain. He was commissioned into field artillery. Okay, so he goes to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for his officer basic course. He also marries his hometown sweetheart, and he is assigned to the 65th Infantry Division, and that's the unit insignia here in your top left with the halberd on the poleaxe on the blue field up here on the left. The 65th Infantry Division trains at Camp Shelby, North Carolina. He joins them in Camp Shelby, North Carolina. He's attached to assigned to the 868th Field Artillery Battalion. It's a battalion of towed 105 millimeter howitzers, and they are dispatched just like the 65th had been with Hennessy. They're dispatched a little bit later, and they're sent to northern France. They come in Le Havre and move in to our positions in northern Germany and participate in Patton's push across Germany and the sweep into northern Germany and the sweep down towards Austria as we moved into Bavaria at the end of the war. Crystal, Big Ed Crystal, had a wonderful reputation serving as a forward observer field artillery officer attached from his battalion with the infantry units that he was supporting in the 65th Infantry Division. You can read stories about, and in his memorial, about how he was always volunteering for the most exposed forward positions. There was a time when they reached the Fulda River and it was unfordable, but they had to get somebody on the other side to find a ford. Crystal swims the Fulda River in the wintertime to get on the other side. They fight their way across Germany. They fight their way down through into Bavaria, the division does. They make their way into Austria in the waning days of the war in Europe. And on May 4th, Crystal, again, volunteers to lead, to accompany a patrol going into the Austrian town of Eferding, not too far from Linz, the city of Linz. They go into Eferding. Some towns are deserted. Some towns people are surrendering. Some towns are doing all of the above. And some towns have pockets of fanatical holdouts. And unfortunately, the little town of Eferding was one of those. And in Eferding, they roll around a corner, the patrol that Crystal was with, they roll around the corner, they run into a roadblock manned by fanatical SS troops. A firefight breaks out. Crystal's there in the heat of it. He's shot and killed. He dies on May 4th, 1944, 4 days before VE Day. So I know in his case, his parents and his wife are back in Minnesota. They're hearing of VE Day, the war in Europe where their son has been and their husband has been fighting is over. They know that they know the war is over. But then about a week later, they get the news that he was killed in action in the last days of the war. Ed was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was one of 15 members of this class that were killed in military service during World War II. And that may not sound like a lot, but keep in mind that the class of 1944 was really only in active military service for a year by the time they got to their units. And so that was a lot of people for a class of 474 men. So Ed was killed in action, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And now I should say that because of that, if you go to West Point, the basketball arena in which West Point's basketball team plays today is called Crystal Arena, named after Ed Crystal. And then finally we've got Bob Foss. So Bob, and this was somewhat interesting, the military, the U.S. Army by 1944 had some sense that things were going in such a good direction with respect to the air war in Europe. And obviously there were still some terrible losses and some real challenges coming, but there's some degree of uncertainty as to just what was going on. But we do know this, there was a real hesitancy to get these new lieutenants who had been commissioned from West Point into the Army Air Forces in June of 1944 overseas. In fact, their stories of order being keep them in the United States, keep them through training. We're beyond the point where we need to be sending these brand new lieutenants overseas to get killed. These are going to be the leaders of our future Air Force. Well, that meant that to their great frustration, these lieutenants like Foss were stuck in the United States for months, going through training and more training, sometimes becoming instructor pilots, sometimes serving on staff. And they were all agitating to get overseas. They had this sense of we're missing the war, we are not serving our role. And so finally, at the 1 year mark, so June of 1945, they start sending their units overseas. And Foss ends up, and now we're going back to the war in the Pacific. Foss ends up flying a P-47 November with a unit called the 1st Fighter Squadron. And they were nicknamed the Fighting Furies. And here's Miss Fury, apparently, sort of a nod to Marvel Comics, I guess, right? He's flying a P-47 Thunderbolt November out of Ishima off the coast of Okinawa, attacking the Japanese mainland on these long overwater 4-hour there and back flights in a single engine fighter bomber. He flies his first combat mission in early August 1945, attacks the Japanese mainland, flies his second combat mission on August 9th, 1945. Same day, he's flying in for the mission, sees a purple-orange flash on the horizon. That's the atomic bomb being dropped on Nagasaki, by the way. He completes his attack on a Japanese airfield, is hit by anti-aircraft fire, knows that he's got to get out over the ocean, nurses his wounded aircraft out over the ocean, bails out, and is rescued by a Navy PBY. So much for the Army-Navy rivalry, right? This guy that beat Navy in that final basketball game ends up being rescued by a Navy search and rescue plane. And he survives the war. So there are players. Well, what about Ed Kelleher? Coach Kelleher stayed at West Point in 1945, coached that team to a 14-1 record. So they did lose. They lost to Penn in the game of the century in Philadelphia. But then, after the 1945 season, Kelleher volunteers to go to occupied Germany and be a volunteer coach for the Army of Occupation in Germany, teaching officers how to be basketball coaches in this sort of desperate effort to keep this demobilizing army, people waiting just to get home, come up with some kind of recreational activities. And this was going on across the board. Ed Kelleher's actually in Munich in July of 1945 as a volunteer coach, and he has a heart attack and dies. And I would argue that he's probably the only active college basketball coach who was active at the time of his death, who is buried in an American military cemetery in Europe. He's buried at the Lorraine Military Cemetery in Europe. Okay, and so that's Kelleher. I will close out by saying two things. Bring us back around to the war in the Pacific, besides, of course, with Foss being shot down while serving in the Pacific. One, Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in the CBI. He actually, West Point graduate, class of 1904, he actually introduced basketball to West Point. So there's a Pacific connection for you guys. And then second, a lot of times you think of the Pacific, you're thinking of the Army, you think of Douglas MacArthur, right? Remember, it was Douglas MacArthur who famously said, "Upon the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds that on other days, on other fields, will bear the fruits of victory." And I think that's really, in a nutshell, what we saw with teams like West Point's basketball team, their football team, their other college athletics, this intercollegiate, well, every cadet was an athlete, intramural or intercollegiate, but participating on the fields of friendly strife learning leadership, learning competitiveness, learning grit and determination in that arena, and then seeing that pay off, hopefully, on other fields, on other days. With that said, I'll just close out for real by saying thank you all so much for watching this. And National Museum of the Pacific War, Lauren, your staff, thank you for having me. I hope I've somewhat lived up to your expectations on this conversation. So thank you.
Jim, I want to thank you for your presentation today. And before I let you go, I want to ask a couple of questions. Most of your story really to me is about the home front. And we're telling the story of home front experiences through the lens of these three guys. Now, knowing that they wanted to go abroad and they wanted to serve their country so badly, do you think that basketball kind of helped them work through that and process what was going on?
Great question, Lauren. And I've thought about that myself. I got to say, and maybe I'm imputing a little bit of my own experiences, admittedly during peacetime back at West Point. I suspect that they were so busy at the time, they were just trying to get through West Point, period. But I also think that basketball was, in many cases, providing them with an outlet. It was providing them with a distraction. It was providing them with an even greater sense of purpose of what they were doing at the time. I would have added, most years it would have given them a chance to get off campus as well, which at West Point is always a nice thing to do in the dreary winter months. We always called it the gloom period. But in their case, they only had 2 road games, so they were still playing on campus. They didn't have that many opportunities to get off campus. But I think it was any kind of distraction would have been a good distraction at this point for those cadets, I think. And this was hopefully a distraction for them and for their fans.
Speaking of the fans, that's my next question.
Okay.
Do you think that the season, as amazing as it was, do you think that was helping sort of the morale of the home front for all of the fans and the people coming to the games?
I think that people were following West Point and Navy athletics a lot more perhaps than they would have been previously. And remember, at the same time, West Point had a terrific football season as well, and a terrific football team. So I think that was part of that same set, that following the academies, seeing them do well, having winning seasons after not so great seasons. I think that was good for morale. I think you say, oh, Army's winning at football, we're winning in the war. Army's winning at basketball, we're winning in the war. Same with Navy. So I think that was helpful in that regard. I mean, we sort of see the same thing today, right? We're proud to see the Army-Navy game being played every December in football, and you're seeing more and more recognition of our veterans. We're continuing to see recognition of our veterans at sporting events. So I think that is part of it.
In your research for your book, were you able to find any anecdotal evidence of the guys, once they were abroad, talking about their love of West Point and of basketball? Maybe during their downtime, if they ran across any Navy grads?
Yeah. Other than, I suppose, the time that Foss was being fished out by a naval aviator in the Pacific, and I'm just making that up. I did think it would have been fun if he had been actually rescued by someone who had played basketball in the Navy. That might have been a nice little touch. Short answer, no, I did not find anything. But what I did find through my research were numerous incidents of members of the class, particularly in Europe, crossing paths with each other and having these fun, odd little reunions in a hospital, in a mess hall, on some muddy German road, sometimes even rescuing or liberating a POW camp and running into classmates that had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge. So those kind of connections were going on, and those were always great connections for these guys. I don't know how much they were sitting back and reminiscing about the good old days of Army football or Army basketball back then.
Jim, I want to thank you one more time for spending a little bit of your day with us and sharing this story of basketball and, giving us a home front perspective during World War II, sharing the story of these three guys, whether they were in the European theater or the Pacific theater. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation and learned something new. The mission of the National Museum of the Pacific War is to foster responsible citizenship and leadership by inspiring all ages with our collection and the enduring relevancy of the stories from the Pacific War. If you have any questions, you can email them to education@nimitzfoundation.org. We'll see you next time.